I do wonder if there is this distraction technique going on with Ukraine, because it does seem like every time Trump has issues back home, whether that's, say, people talking a bit more than he'd like about Epstein, or affordability issues, inflation, anything like that, suddenly he gets very focused on the foreign sphere and things like Ukraine, because he knows that that will distract the media.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today I'm joined by Bethany Elliott, journalist and commentator. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Hi Jo, thanks so much for having me back.
So let's discuss Trump's comments on Europe that he made in an interview with Politico yesterday. And he described Europe as being weak, as decaying. I mean, those are really strong words, aren't they?
So he gave this interview to Politico and he said of Europe's leaders, I think they're weak. They want to be so politically correct. I think they don't know what to do. Europe doesn't know what to do. And he said the continent is decaying. And he seemed to also take it quite personally. He said that his own roots are in Europe. This is one of the great places in the world, and they're allowing people to just come in unchecked, unvetted. And this is certainly not the first time that this White House administration has insulted Europe. The national security strategies, it just came out, it said that Europe has been greatly harmed by its climate change and net zero ideologies, that there's a risk of civilizational erasure, migration policies are transforming the continent and creating strife. And of course, back in February, the US Vice President J.D. Vance spoke at the Munich Security Conference, and he stunned the hall by saying that the greatest threat to the continent isn't Russia or China, but actually the threat within, that continental politicians were not addressing issues like migration, and that politicians representing populist parties should not be excluded. And even back then, those kinds of comments caused strife between the US and Europe, because at the time, the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, said that the US was trying to pick a fight with Europe and that you shouldn't pick a fight with your friends. And the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, said that Vance's comments were not acceptable. And this also, what Trump said in this Politico interview, it confirms what we've heard, that there are very serious US-Europe tensions behind the scenes, particularly over Ukraine. Back in February, Kaja Kallas went to Washington to talk about Ukraine, but then she didn't meet the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, allegedly due to scheduling issues, but that's what they always say. And then last month, Politico reported that Kallas has a very strained relationship with the White House over Ukraine, and that Rubio had been declining to hold meetings with her. So I think in terms of the motives of why Trump is making these kinds of comments about Europe right now, it plays well to his MAGA base. But then at the end of the day, this is his second term. We think he's not going to try and go for a third term against the Constitution, but he's sacrificing allies for the sake of people who are already voting for him and supporting him. I think it's also a kind of bullying. The continent of Europe is reliant on the US for its security, and he knows that. European leaders throughout this term have tried to appease Trump by flattering him, by meeting his demands on things like upping defence spending. So he knows that he can bully Europe because it's an easy target. And I also wonder how much of this right now is very personal, because we know that Trump thinks in these very personalised terms. In that Politico article, he was saying that Putin and Zelensky hate each other, which of course they do. One tried to invade the other's country. But he does seem to see the world in these kind of high school terms of who likes each other, who hates each other. And we know that last week there was this leaked phone call between European leaders and Zelensky, in which the French President Emmanuel Macron warned that the US could be about to betray Ukraine on the issue of territory without providing clarity on security guarantees. The German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said that Zelensky has to be extremely careful, and the Finnish President Alexander Stubb said we cannot leave Ukraine and Volodymyr alone with these guys, which was apparently a reference to Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. So Stubb and Mark Rutte, who was also in the call in particular, have really tried very hard to be friends with Trump. Rutte is known as the Trump whisperer. It's one of the main reasons why he got the job of NATO Secretary General. So I do wonder if, with that leaked phone call having come out last week, Trump is maybe feeling a bit betrayed. He feels a bit insulted by people in Europe who he thought were his friends. And in addition, I interviewed a former advisor to the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and I asked him how it was that Abe managed to have such a good bond with Trump, such a good relationship. And he said there were several reasons why Abe managed that. One was that he'd involved the whole Trump family in the initial meeting. He was able to also portray himself as a victim of the liberal media. But most importantly, he never talked down to Trump. No matter what Trump didn't know, what he was surprised by about history or politics, whatever, he never seemed surprised or condescended to him. And that came in contrast to the European leaders, who Trump found very condescending. And apparently Trump has this very strong instinct for when people are talking down to him, and the Europeans have been guilty of that. But in terms of the consequences of this Politico article and these very strong words on Europe, first of all, the Russians are going to be absolutely loving this, because back in February, after Vance's speech in Munich, Russian state television said it was a very strong speech. The national security strategy rejected the idea of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance and criticised Europe. So all of that is music to Putin's ears. And particularly now, we're at a very sensitive time with Ukraine negotiations. And these kinds of divisions between the US and Europe, it divides NATO unity. It creates a very fractured response to Ukraine with two blocs developing. And it takes Europe's voice, which is very supportive of Ukraine, out of negotiations potentially, if there are these rows going on. And it makes it easier for Russia to manipulate the US. If you look at statements over time by people like the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, the Kremlin has for a long time been pushing this narrative that if the US and Russia could get their heads together and kind of push out Europe, then there could be a deal over Ukraine. But the Europeans are the saboteurs. And I do wonder if in these meetings between the US and Russia, Trump is kind of listening to these narratives from the Kremlin that the Europeans are the enemy, that they are the saboteurs. And I think also, in terms of what it means for Europe, Trump, with these comments, he's pushing the Europeans into a corner. He's forcing them to respond. Because yesterday, the UK Prime Minister spokesperson pushed back, said that they rejected the idea that the UK has been working on the coalition of the willing, on sanctions on Russia, highlighted the strong relationship between Trump and Starmer. And the Foreign Secretary here, Yvette Cooper, said that all she saw in Europe was strength. And then the UK Trade Secretary Peter Kyle tried to insist in an interview to The Sun that Trump might not have been referring to Britain when he hit out about Europe being weak. But that wasn't convincing, because after Kyle said that, Trump spoke overnight at a rally and he attacked Britain's migration and energy policies. And he said if they don't go back to oil, a lot of bad things are happening in the UK. So he's pushing Europe into a very tough position of trying to appease him, but also trying to push back slightly on those comments. Today is Prime Minister's Questions here in the UK. Keir Starmer is likely to be asked about this and have to try and come up with a response. And it's especially difficult for Starmer personally, because in the Politico interview, Trump criticised the London Mayor Sadiq Khan. He called him a horrible, vicious, disgusting mayor. And back in July, Trump attacked Khan in front of Starmer, and Starmer said, he's a friend of mine, actually. And I think also this shows how little respect Trump has for traditional allies like the US, who share common values.
And at the moment, there are fears amongst European allies that Trump could walk away from Ukraine. But if we take NATO, for example, Trump said numerous times that he would pull the US out of NATO. And it's been credited that the rhetoric that he was using has actually incentivized a lot of NATO allies to bolster their own defense spending. Do you think that perhaps with Ukraine, for example, Trump's using that rhetoric in order to incentivize Europeans to act accordingly?
Potentially. I mean, it's a nice theory, but it does suggest that Trump is kind of playing 4D chess with all of us. And I think to some extent, we know he is a very emotional person. He does say what he thinks. He does respond to insults, and he does get into these kinds of spats, as we've seen with Sadiq Khan. And I think it also speaks to a broader problem, which is that we are now getting kind of two blocks developing, the US and Europe, over Ukraine, because the Daily Telegraph reported that the US is pushing for things to move very fast on Ukraine. Initially, there was this Thanksgiving deadline, but now today the FT was saying that behind the scenes, Trump wants it to be Christmas. Trump's being very impatient, whereas Europe is urging caution because they want there to be a long-term solution. They don't want Putin to come back again later. Europe's worried that Trump wants this quick fix and then he'll move his attention elsewhere, which will only encourage Russian aggression further down the line. But I do also wonder if maybe we're seeing how Trump's desire for the Nobel Peace Prize is kind of perverting American foreign policy now. Why does he want it to be quick? Is it just because he wants it on his application form for next year's Nobel Peace Prize? And it is surprising to see these kinds of tensions coming out. It's not just Trump's comments to Politico. On Monday, the French, German and British leaders were meeting in London, and the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz suggested that he was sceptical, in his words, of some of the details he was seeing in documents coming from the US side. So it might be that Trump is kind of playing games with Europe about trying to bolster support, but there are a range of different motives here, and some of them are very personal.
In the Politico interview, Trump also spoke about elections in Ukraine. He said that they haven't had an election in a long time. And for context, Zelensky's term was due to end at the end of May 2024. But as the country is under martial law, elections have been suspended. But Zelensky has now come out and said that Ukraine is ready for elections, provided that security can be assured. He's denied that he's clinging on to power. What are the security guarantees that the Ukrainian leader is asking for? And how do you think that Trump's going to respond to this?
It's a very interesting situation. As you say, he said that they haven't had an election in a long time. He said, they talk about a democracy, but it gets to a point where it's not a democracy anymore. And it's not entirely new, because over the weekend, his son, Don Jr., claimed that Zelensky was prolonging the war to maintain power. I think, first of all, this is capitalising on weakness, as we were saying about the bullying of Europe. Trump knows this is a tough time for Zelensky. not just due to the negotiations that are going on, but also because of this ongoing scandal in Ukraine about corruption in the energy sector. Zelensky's just lost his very close ally, Andrei Yermak, as his chief of staff. And of course, we've seen this in the past with Trump about the elections issue back in March. Some of his administration were talking to opposition figures in Ukraine like Petro Poroshenko and Yulia Tymoshenko. So this shows that Trump's shifting on Ukraine for all of Europe and Ukraine's efforts hasn't really shifted. And he's still susceptible to Russian narratives. The Kremlin has been pushing forever this idea of Zelensky as a dictator. And I think, first of all, why isn't Trump talking about Putin? Putin is the one who has imprisoned and killed political opponents. He's cracked down on the free press. He's been in power for 25 years. If Trump really cares about free and fair elections and democracy promotion, Russia's the place to start. As you say, this martial law situation, it's all been legal. There can't be elections under martial law. The Ukrainian parliament has repeatedly extended martial law. Also, it's very dangerous. You would have people massing at rallies and voting booths, very easy targets for Russian strikes. It's impractical. You've got people at the front and abroad. How do they vote? How do they run for office? The Russians would do their best to launch information campaigns to try and get their own candidates in. And there's the question of what this means for negotiations with Russia in the course of the war. So I think that, first of all, Zelensky is kind of calling Trump's bluff here. And it's not the first time he's done this. Back in February, after Trump called him a dictator, Zelensky offered to stand down in return for peace and NATO membership. So he's just said in response to this Politico article that he needs the US to help me, and together with European partners, we can ensure the security needed to hold elections, and that Ukraine could do so in the next 60 to 90 days. But the Ukrainian parliament would also have to approve some legislation in order to make this happen. It is a shift in position. Before, Ukraine has said only after a ceasefire for elections. But I think, first of all, it's showing, of course, he's not a dictator. But it's very interesting that he's demanding the US's help here, because I think it's showing that Trump really doesn't want to get involved in providing any kind of security guarantees. And the fact he's saying, well, I'll do it, but you have to help me, is perhaps exposing that then Trump, when he's actually asked to do something, will back off. And I think there could be a secondary clever strategy here, because Ukraine wants US security guarantees after the war ends. This could be a clever bridging. It could be a smart way of getting the US to provide some short-term security, some boots on the ground, maybe, who knows. And then Zelensky could say, well, you did that, so let's think longer term after the war ends. But also, I think in Trump's own mind, he thinks that this would get rid of Zelensky, who's just in his head a problem and an obstacle and a difficulty. In September, Zelensky said he wouldn't seek re-election and that his goal was to finish the war. But currently, he is the most popular candidate, with the Ukrainian ambassador to London, Valery Zaluzhny, slightly behind in second place. So it's interesting to see what will happen on that.
Do we also have any indication of how Trump felt about Zelensky meeting with European allies in London yesterday?
We sort of have in an indirect sense, because I don't believe he's responded directly to those conversations. But in the Politico interview, he said that Zelensky is going to have to get on the ball and start accepting things because he's losing. Zelensky reportedly told his European counterparts that over the weekend, US negotiators were pushing him to give away all of the Donbass regions, that's Luhansk and Donetsk. And a Ukrainian official told Axios that after Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff met Putin in Moscow last week, the US offer for Ukraine actually worsened. So many European officials are differing from Trump's timeline, which is apparently now Christmas, and saying that it will take weeks or months in order to get some kind of deal together. The basis of a US deal, according to the FT today, is that Ukraine would accept some territorial losses in exchange for unspecified US security guarantees. Yesterday evening, Zelensky said he was working very actively on components on a deal to end the war, that he's ready to present this to the US. There seems to be a 20-point framework agreement, and also a separate document on security guarantees and a third document on the reconstruction post-war of Ukraine. Zelensky expects to talk more to Trump's team this week. And Zelensky said in this document, there's a security guarantee that would be similar to Article 5 in NATO. So collective security, an attack on one constitutes an attack on all. Senior Trump officials told the Wall Street Journal that they're not pushing Ukraine into a deal it doesn't want, not pushing into a bad deal, but the Europeans are worried that this is a sticking faster solution. So yeah, we're seeing perhaps they'll be able to come together in the end, but we know that Trump has been pushing, not just now, but back in October when he met with Zelensky, for him to give up the whole of the Donbass, which of course is what Putin wants. And so we're seeing some very different approaches to this war.
In the Politico interview, Trump was asked about the US economy, and he graded it an A plus 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 plus. That's what he said. He's also been out rallying in Pennsylvania. He's claiming that prices are coming down tremendously. However, inflation still sits at 3%, which is the same as when he came into office. And polling is showing that Americans are increasingly blaming Trump for high prices. How would you say that affordability and the economy is going down with that MAGA base? And with Trump, with the rhetoric that he's using, how do you think that's also going down with them?
It will be interesting to see what happens, because it shows that he's not really dealing with the concerns of his voters, because Trump was voted in large part due to inflation and the cost of living. So the fact that he's not really engaging with that and doesn't have the seriousness and honesty to say, yes, prices are still high and the economy does have its issues, is really quite worrying. And it does suggest that perhaps his base will turn away from him if they feel that their concerns are not being dealt with, if they feel kind of disenfranchised, perhaps. Saying that the economy is plus, 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 when it isn't, when there are those affordability issues, is a really worrying situation indeed, and suggests he's not listening to his base.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has recently split away from Trump, she did an interview in which she said that she's America first, and she's criticized Trump for not focusing on domestic issues. There's also reports that there are other Republicans who have expressed their frustrations with the president over affordability as well. Do you think we can expect other Marjorie Taylor Greene styled walkaways from the president? And what sort of picture does this paint for the president in the lead up to the midterms?
It doesn't paint a good picture for him on the lead up to the midterms, but I think that this is a natural process, because Trump is, with all due respect to him, not a young man. And also, as we said earlier, this is his second term. So it's natural that within the Republican base, people are going to start positioning for the next election. They want to be the next Republican leader, and they'll want to try and differentiate themselves from him and try to gather some support now. So this is something he will expect, and it does seem like inflation and affordability will be one of those key issues for appealing to voters. And what you said about how he's being criticised for not dealing with domestic issues, I do wonder if there is this distraction, this technique going on with Ukraine, because it does seem like every time Trump has issues back home, whether that's, say, people talking a bit more than he'd like about Epstein, or affordability issues, inflation, anything like that, suddenly he gets very focused on the foreign sphere and things like Ukraine, because he knows that that will distract the media.
But how do you think that works with his MAGA base as well? Because he came in saying that he was going to, have less of a focus on Ukraine, on the international sphere, didn't he?
Yeah, it is interesting in terms of how he does seem to be upsetting his MAGA base in different ways. I also saw in the Politico article that he was talking about Latin America. Of course, he's deployed this military force to pressure the regime in Venezuela. And in that Politico article, he declined to rule out putting American troops into Venezuela as part of efforts to overthrow the leader Nicolas Maduro. And he said that Maduro has been exporting drugs and some very dangerous people. But what would Republicans in the US, who famously don't like forever wars and went for Trump because he promised that there wouldn't be forever wars, that he would wrap up all of these conflicts around the world, say to the idea of a ground invasion of Venezuela, which would not be easy? And in terms of deploying ground troops, Trump was saying in this Politico interview about, I don't want to rule it in or out. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk to you about military strategy. So that kind of ambiguity, it's very worrying. And I think a lot of Republicans will be hearing that and saying, well, is this the next forever war? He doesn't seem to be making that much progress on Ukraine. And then, of course, there's now this issue with Latin America. So, yeah, not just inflation, but also in terms of foreign policy, he does seem to be upsetting a lot of Republicans and his MAGA base.
Well, Bethany, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you so much for having me.